Democracy. We speak of it like gravity, a universal force that pulls all civilizations toward the same inevitable destination. But what if democracy isn't a law of nature? What if it's a cultural artifact, born in one very specific soil, under very specific conditions? For 70 years, the West has tried to plant democracy in the Middle East. And for 70 years, it has watched the same pattern repeat. Republics promising freedom descending into chaos. Elections empowering extremist-triggering military coups. Constitutions written in hope becoming epitaphs for failed states. Yet the monarchies endure. The kingdoms thrive. The very systems we're taught to call backward deliver stability, prosperity, and peace. This is the paradox. And tonight, we're going to trace its roots back 3,000 years, to the cradle of civilization itself. We'll journey through the clash of pharaohs and priests, the rise and fall of empires, the colonial wounds that never healed, and the brutal trilemma facing the Middle East today: stable kingdoms, military republics, or Islamist regimes mired in terror and failure. No quick takes, no easy answers. Just the raw, uncomfortable truth that history has been trying to tell us all along. Welcome to the paradox. 1. The ancient binary, Egypt's eternal struggle. Pharaohs versus priests. To understand why democracy feels foreign in the Middle East, we must go back. Not decades, not centuries. 3,000 years. To ancient Egypt, where the political DNA of this region was first forged in sand and blood. Power in Egypt wasn't diffuse. It wasn't negotiated. It crystallized around two forces locked in eternal struggle: the pharaoh, divine king, military commander, enforcer of cosmic order, and the priests, religious elites who wielded not swords, but something far more dangerous: the keys to the afterlife itself. By the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, the priests of Amun controlled up to 30% of Egypt's arable land. They weren't just spiritual leaders. They were an economic empire rivaling the throne itself. And when power concentrates like that, collision is inevitable. Consider Akhenaten, 1353 BCE, a pharaoh who looked at the priests and saw not holy men, but extremists, fanatics who prioritized divine rituals over the welfare of the living, who hoarded grain while peasants starved, who demanded sacrifices while the kingdom bled. So Akhenaten did the unthinkable. He smashed their idols, closed their temples, stripped them of their wealth, and declared a new god, Aten, the sun disk, whose worship belonged to the pharaoh. The priests never forgave him. After his death, they erased his name from history. Every monument, every inscription, as if he had never existed. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was a pattern one that would echo through 3 millennia. The military protector versus the religious fanatic. The king who builds granaries versus the priest who demands purity. The bloodthirsty bastard who keeps order versus the zealot who offers only chaos. Ramesses III assassinated in 1155 BCE in a harem conspiracy possibly orchestrated by priests. The third intermediate period when priests ruled Thebes as shadow kings and Egypt fractured into competing fiefdoms. The pattern was set, and it never really ended. Fast forward to the Islamic era. The Mamluks, 1250 to 1517 CE, slave soldiers who rose to become kings, not through birthright, through merit, through blood, through absolute loyalty to a centralized system. Europe built its power through feudalism, a messy web of lords and vassals, oaths and obligations. Power was fragmented, negotiated, shared. That fragmentation created space. Space for bargaining, for charters, for the slow, painful birth of parliaments. The Mamluks did the opposite. Their ectogrants weren't hereditary fiefs. They were revocable salaries, payments for service that could be stripped away at any moment. No vassals, no oaths, no power base independent of the Sultan, and it worked. At Ain Jalut in 1260, their professional army, 40,000 strong, crushed the Mongol horde. 20,000 invaders dead. The unstoppable force stopped. But here's what they didn't build: pluralism, representation, checks and balances. Scholars like Lisa Blades and Eric Cheney argue this is the fork in the road. Europe's messy feudalism created the institutions that would eventually birth democracy. The Middle East's efficient centralization created a culture of hierarchy, of strongmen and followers. Not better, not worse, just different. A different path, with a different destination. 2. The colonial wound, how empires sowed seeds of failure. For centuries, these ancient patterns endured. Empires rose and fell, but the structures remained. Then came the Europeans. World War I shattered the Ottoman Empire like glass. And in the wreckage, Britain and France saw opportunity. Sykes Picot, 1916. Two diplomats in a room, drawing lines on a map. Not along tribal boundaries. Not along ethnic lines. Not along any organic division that had evolved over millennia. Just lines. They created states that had never existed. Threw together peoples who had never lived as one, and called it progress. But the cruelty ran deeper than borders. Divide and rule. That was the strategy. Empower minorities to govern majorities. Alawites over Sunnis in Syria. Sunnis over Shias in Iraq. Create resentment. Engineer dependence. Ensure they'd never unite against you. Then World War II ended, and the colonial powers retreated. But the game didn't stop. It just changed players. America's informal empire. The Cold War made democracy a luxury the Middle East couldn't afford. Not when there were communists to fight. Not when there was oil to secure. Scholar Pharaohs documents the betrayal in painful detail. Iran, 1953 CIA overthrows a democratically elected prime minister. Egypt, America backs Nasser's revolution, aka military coup. Saudi Arabia, billions in weapons for a medieval monarchy. Iraq's support for Saddam, until he becomes inconvenient. Every time a liberal movement emerged, it was crushed. Every time democracy threatened Western interests, autocrats were armed. Every time the people tried to choose their own path, they were redirected. And oil, the black blood that made everything worse. Oil created rentier states, governments that don't need their people. They don't need taxes. They don't need consent. They just need to distribute enough wealth to buy loyalty. No taxation without representation. No taxation, no representation needed. By 2025, Georges notes, the instability we see isn't ancient. It's recent. It's modern. It's our creation. Iraq, after 2003, a functioning dictatorship destroyed, replaced with chaos. Libya, after 2011, a stable regime toppled, replaced with warlords. Syria, a civil war fueled by foreign weapons and foreign agendas. Democracy in the Middle East failed not because it was impossible, but because every time it tried to grow, someone cut it down. 3. The theories, clashes, illiberalism, and the rentier trap. So how do we make sense of this? How do we understand why democracy succeeds in some places and shatters in others? Theories, frameworks, attempts to map the unmappable. Let's start with the most controversial. Samuel Huntington. The Clash of Civilizations, 1996. His thesis: the post-Cold War world wouldn't be shaped by ideology. Not capitalism versus communism, but by culture, by civilization, by ancient identities awakening. And at the bloody borders of Islamic civilization, he predicted conflict. Not because Muslims are violent, but because Islam, like all universalist religions, claims ultimate truth. It doesn't see itself as one option among many. It sees itself as the answer. Critics called Huntington racist, orientalist, a prophet of self-fulfilling doom. Edward said tore him apart, accused him of drawing lines that would encourage the very conflicts he predicted. And yet look at the map. The bloodiest conflicts of the past 30 years cluster exactly where Huntington drew his borders. Maybe he wasn't causing the clash. Maybe he was just the first to admit it was already happening. Zakaria offered a different lens. The Future of Freedom, 2003. A liberal democracy, that was his term. Elections without freedom. Ballots without rights. The form of democracy with none of its substance. In healthy democracies, institutions come first. Rule of law, independent courts, free press. Then you add elections. But in the Middle East, the sequence reversed. Elections first before the culture was ready. Before the institutions were strong. Before anyone agreed on the rules of the game. And what happened? The people voted. They voted for Islamists, the only organized alternative to failed autocrats. The Islamists won. Then they used their power to shut down the very system that elevated them. Zakaria's solution? Liberalize first. Democratize later. Build the economy. Educate the people. Strengthen the courts. Then maybe risk elections, like Singapore, like South Korea. Autocracy with a roadmap to freedom. But there's another force at work, one that makes that roadmap nearly impossible to follow. Oil. Rentier state theory explains the trap. When a government's wealth comes from natural resources, not taxes, the social contract breaks. Rulers don't need productive citizens. They just need compliant ones. So they buy loyalty, free healthcare, free education, no income tax, cradle-to-grave welfare. And it works. The Gulf monarchies are stable, prosperous. Their people are among the happiest on earth. But there's a cost. No representation, no voice, no stake in governance. Citizens become clients, subjects, not sovereigns. By 2025, this has evolved into new rentierism, sovereign wealth funds, financialization, diversification away from oil. But the structure remains. The rulers still buy loyalty. The people still trade freedom for security. And when Islamists do win elections, Shadi Hamid documented the pattern. The Temptations of Power, 2014. They promise pluralism and opposition, then implement theocracy in power, not because they lied, but because their ideology, like all universalist ideologies, doesn't believe in permanent disagreement. They see democracy as a tool, not a value. So here's where we stand. Culture clashes with imported systems. Elections empower those who don't believe in elections. And oil wealth makes accountability irrelevant. The theories all point to the same conclusion. Democracy, as we know it, may simply be the wrong model. 4. The data, 2025 realities. When numbers tell stories, theories are elegant. But data doesn't care about elegance. It just shows us what is. So let's look at 2025. Let's see what the numbers tell us about democracy, autocracy, and survival in the Middle East. The World Happiness Report. A simple question. How satisfied are you with your life? On a scale of 0 to 10. The disparities in the Middle East are the widest on earth. UAE, 6.8 out of 10, ranked 22 globally. Yemen, 3.2 out of 10, ranked 147, one a monarchy. One a republic turned Islamist battlefield. One has shopping malls and universal health care. One has cholera and starvation. The pattern holds across the region. Monarchies, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, all in the top half of global happiness rankings. Republics, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen clustered at the bottom. But happiness is subjective, right? Let's look at something harder. The IMF's 2025 projections for MENA, Middle East, and North Africa. Overall growth, 2.6%. Modest, fragile. But dig deeper. and you see the split. Gulf monarchies, 3 to 4% growth, stable. Diversifying. Conflict republics, Gaza, Yemen, Lebanon, negative growth. Collapsing infrastructure. Debt spirals. Freedom indices tell the same story. 70% of Middle Eastern democracies are classified as flawed or hybrid regimes. They have elections, but elections don't mean freedom. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. The Arab Spring, 2011. The moment the world thought democracy was finally coming. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain. Millions in the streets demanding freedom. Dictators falling like dominoes, and they got elections. Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood wins. Mohamed Morsi becomes president. Then the repression begins. Constitutional amendments to enshrine Islamic law. Crackdowns on secular opposition. Attacks on Christians spike. 2013. The military takes back control. And here's the uncomfortable statistic. Attacks on Coptic Christians dropped by 40% under military rule. What does that tell us? That the democratically elected Islamists were more brutal to minorities than the military dictatorship. Tunisia was supposed to be the success story. The one place where it worked, and for a while, it did. Coalition governments, constitutional reforms, peaceful transitions. But by 2025, even Tunisia has slid back. Presidential power grabs, suspended parliament, emergency rule. The experiment faltering. Libya, a stable dictatorship destroyed, replaced with warlords and slave markets. Syria, 500,000 dead in a civil war that never ends. Yemen, a humanitarian catastrophe fueled by proxy wars. Democracy didn't come to the Arab Spring. Chaos did. And in the chaos, the extremists thrived. Hamas, Hezbollah, designated terrorist organizations by the US, EU, and others. Documented crimes against humanity. Rocket attacks on civilians, using human shields. Suicide bombings in markets and buses. These aren't political parties. They're theocratic militias that reject the fundamental premise of democracy, that power can be peacefully transferred. That disagreement isn't heresy. And then there's Israel, often held up as the Middle East's only democracy. But by 2025, the documentation is overwhelming. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, UN Special Rapporteurs, even the International Court of Justice. The findings: a system of apartheid, over 700 laws that grant different rights based on ethnicity, military occupation lasting nearly 6 decades, segregated roads, separate legal systems, unequal resource allocation. Former Israeli prime ministers, security chiefs, and soldiers have admitted it. The system is designed to maintain Jewish demographic supremacy, not equality under law. 2025 reports link this system to the atrocities in Gaza. Thousands of civilians dead, entire neighborhoods erased, starvation used as a weapon of war. So the model democracy in the Middle East isn't one. Not by the standards we claim to uphold. Which brings us to the militaries. They're not democratic. They don't pretend to be. But here's what they do offer: relative freedom for minorities. Egypt's military protects Coptic Christians not out of liberalism, but pragmatism. They prevent sectarian chaos. Jordan's monarchy guarantees Christian and Circassian representation. It's not freedom. It's order. And in a region where the alternative is often mass-killing, order becomes its own kind of mercy. On X, formerly Twitter, the conversations in 2024 and 2025 reflect this exhaustion. User threads lamenting democracy charades, praising monarchies for stability, asking why the West keeps pushing a model that keeps failing. The data is clear. The pattern is undeniable. In the Middle East, democratic republics struggle. Autocratic monarchies endure. and Islamist democracies become theocratic nightmares. The numbers don't lie. 5. The welfare argument, what rights really mean. Let's talk about human rights. The West loves this phrase, deploys it like a weapon, uses it to judge, to sanction, to invade. But what does it actually mean? Economist Amartya Sen spent his career trying to answer that question. His conclusion: freedom isn't just political. It's economic, social, material. You can't exercise your right to free speech if you're starving. You can't organize politically if you're dying of preventable disease. You can't participate in democracy if you're illiterate and desperate. First-order rights: food, water, shelter, healthcare, education. Without these, all other rights are abstract, theoretical, meaningless. The Gulf monarchies understood this. UAE, 80 to 90% healthcare coverage, free for citizens. Qatar, 99% literacy rate, free education through university. Kuwait, no income tax, generous welfare from cradle to grave. And the people? Generally content. Not because they have political freedom, but because they have economic security. Compare that to democratic republics in the region. Lebanon, democratic elections but no electricity, collapsing currency, garbage piling in streets. Iraq, democratic constitution but corruption eating 30% of GDP, crumbling infrastructure. So here's the uncomfortable question. If you had to choose between political freedom with economic misery or economic security with political limits, which would you pick? The millions fleeing democratic failures for autocratic stability have answered. They're voting with their feet. 2025 data from the World Happiness Report confirms it. Happiness correlates more strongly with GDP per capita than with democracy scores. UAE, 6.810 happiness. Authoritarian. Egypt, 4.910 happiness. Authoritarian with elections, both autocratic. But one delivers welfare. One doesn't, and the happiness gap shows it. In 2025, as global crises multiply inflation, debt, climate disasters, the stable autocracies provide safety, not freedom, safety. And for populations traumatized by decades of chaos, that's not a small thing. Western human rights discourse focuses on negative rights. Freedom from censorship, from arrest, from state control. But the Middle East is asking for positive rights. Freedom to eat, to heal, to build a life. Both are valid, but only one keeps you alive. Maybe the real measure of a government isn't how it's elected, but how it protects its people from collapse. 6. Counter-arguments. Is this inevitable? Now let's steel-man the opposition. Because everything I've said someone, somewhere, is furious at me for saying it. So let's address the counter-arguments head-on. Culture isn't destiny. Democracy works in Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Your argument is cultural determinism, and it's racist. Fair point. Indonesia has made democracy work. 320 million people, multiple religions, 17,000 islands, and relatively stable democratic transition since 1998. But here's the rebuttal. Indonesia didn't have Sykes-Picot drawing its borders. It didn't have a century of colonial divide and rule. It didn't have oil wealth creating rentier dependence. It didn't sit at the crossroads of global proxy wars. Geography matters. History matters. Context matters. Indonesia's challenges were real, but they weren't the same challenges. And even there, as Sharia law, periodic Islamist movements, ethnic tensions, democracy is fragile, negotiated, constantly under pressure. It works, but barely. You're ignoring non-oil monarchies. Jordan and Morocco don't have oil, and they're stable. So it's not about rentierism. Also fair. Jordan's monarchy survives without oil wealth. Morocco's king remains popular without petroleum rents. But look closer. Jordan, $2.5 billion in annual U.S. military aid. Strategic rent. Morocco, tourism, phosphates, EU trade deals, and a king who carefully modernizes without threatening tradition. They succeed through adaptation, careful reforms, gradual opening, managed pluralism, constitutional monarchies that give just enough freedom to prevent explosion. They're not Western democracies. They're hybrid models mixing monarchy, Islam, limited democracy, and strategic partnerships. In other words, they're not following the Western script. They're writing their own, which actually proves the point. When Middle Eastern countries succeed, it's by adapting systems to their context, not importing them wholesale. You're justifying dictatorship. Human rights are universal. Democracy is the only legitimate form of government. This is the hardest one, because it's not just political, it's moral. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says all humans deserve dignity, freedom, voice. I don't disagree. But how that voice is expressed, when those freedoms can be safely guaranteed, what sequence of reforms works? These aren't universal. They're contextual. Britain took 800 years to evolve from Magna Carta to universal suffrage. America was founded on all men are created equal while enslaving millions. France guillotined tens of thousands in the name of liberty. Democracy wasn't given to the West. It was earned through centuries of blood, compromise, and institutional evolution. We're asking the Middle East to do in decades what took the West centuries. And when it doesn't work instantly, we call them backward. I'm not justifying dictatorship. I'm questioning whether one-size-fits-all universalism is wise. Whether ignoring history, culture, and context serves anyone. Whether forcing a model that repeatedly fails is ethical. Maybe the question isn't, why can't they do democracy, right? Maybe it's, why do we keep insisting there's only one right way? 7. The path forward, beyond the trilemma. So where does this leave us? In 2025, the world is shifting. American hegemony waning. European influence declining. China rising. India rising. A multipolar world emerging. For the first time in a century, the Middle East isn't being told what to do. It has space. Space to experiment, to adapt, to forge something new. We're already seeing it. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 diversifying beyond oil. UAE's technological revolution becoming a hub for AI, space, renewable energy. Gulf Cooperation Council regional economic integration. These aren't democracies. But they're not stagnant autocracies either. They're evolving. Women driving in Saudi Arabia. Labor law reforms in the Gulf. Tourist visas opening closed kingdoms. Entertainment sectors replacing religious police. Slow changes. Controlled changes. But changes nonetheless. Is it liberal democracy? No. Is it moving toward greater freedom? Yes. At its own pace. On its own terms. Fawaz Gerges warns, if we keep ignoring the historical roots, we'll keep perpetuating failure. The West can't gift democracy. It can't bomb nations into freedom. It can't sanction people into pluralism. What it can do is stop interfering. Stop backing coups against elected governments it doesn't like. Stop arming autocrats while preaching democracy. Stop drawing lines and expecting others to live within them. Let organic movements grow. Let civil society develop without external pressure. Let economies modernize without political strings attached. Maybe democracy will emerge. Maybe it won't. Maybe something entirely new will develop, a hybrid model blending tradition with modernity, religion with pragmatism, hierarchy with accountability. The next generation in the Middle East is the most educated in history. They're connected to the world. They speak multiple languages. They see what works elsewhere and what fails. They'll decide what freedom means for them. Not in Western terms, not in academic theories, but in lived experience. The trilemma remains: stable kingdoms offering welfare without voice, military republics offering order without choice, Islamist regimes offering purity without peace. But maybe the answer isn't picking one. Maybe it's transcending the trilemma entirely. Constitutional monarchies with real parliaments, managed democracies with strong institutions, federal systems respecting tribal and sectarian autonomy, economic zones experimenting with different rules, 1,000 experiments instead of one imposed model. Let Yemen try something different than UA. Let Jordan chart a different path than Egypt. Let each nation learn from its own mistakes instead of repeating someone else's blueprint. And measure success not by elections held, but by lives improved. Infant mortality dropping, literacy rising, healthcare expanding, poverty shrinking. These are the metrics that matter. Not whether people vote, but whether they eat, whether they learn, whether they thrive. Amartya Sen said development is freedom, but he meant all freedoms, not just political ones. Freedom from hunger, freedom from disease, freedom from ignorance, freedom to build a future. Maybe that's where the Middle East starts. Not with ballots, with basics. 3,000 years ago, pharaohs and priests battled for power. The pharaoh built granaries. The priest demanded purity. The people needed the granaries. Today, the battle continues. Military strongmen promise stability. Islamists promise salvation. Democrats promise voice. The people still need the granaries. This isn't a simple story. It's not democracy good, autocracy bad. It's not West enlightened, East backward. It's not culture destiny, change impossible. It's complicated. A region shaped by ancient empires and colonial wounds, by oil wealth and sectarian divides, by foreign interventions and internal struggles, by genuine aspirations for freedom and genuine fear of chaos. And in the middle of all this theory, all this history, all this geopolitics are people, just trying to live, trying to raise families, trying to find dignity in an indifferent world. They don't care if their government matches a Western textbook. They care if it works. Misery under democracy feels the same as misery under autocracy. But stability, even imperfect stability, prevents worse misery. It prevents sectarian massacres. It prevents state collapse. It prevents the kind of chaos where extremism grows like weeds. That's not an argument for oppression. It's a recognition that in societies still healing from trauma, order is the foundation on which everything else must be built. And maybe, slowly, carefully, deliberately, that foundation can support something more. More voice, more freedom. But it has to grow from within, not imposed from without. The paradox of democracy in the Middle East isn't that it's impossible. It's that we keep trying to plant it in soil we poisoned. We drew the borders. We backed the dictators. We sold the weapons. We toppled the governments. We created the chaos. And then we asked, why can't you people do democracy? Maybe the lesson isn't that democracy fails there. Maybe it's that our version of it imposed, rushed, culturally deaf was doomed from the start. But that doesn't mean freedom is impossible. It just means it will look different than we expected, sound different than we imagined, arrive on a timeline we can't dictate, from the Pharaohs to the Mamluks, from colonial empires to the Arab Spring, from oil booms to Vision 2030. The Middle East has always been a crucible, where empires are forged and broken, where civilizations rise and clash, where humanity's oldest questions about power, justice, and freedom are asked again and again. The answers won't be simple. They won't satisfy Western sensibilities. They won't fit academic models. They won't arrive on our schedule. But they will be theirs. Democracy is not the god of nations. It's just one of their passing myths. And in the Middle East, they're writing their own mythology, whether we understand it or not. Whether we like it or not, maybe that's the only honest place to end. Not with answers, but with the humility to admit we don't have them. If this challenged how you see the world, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you think, then it did its job. I don't ask you to agree with everything here. I ask you to sit with the complexity, to resist easy answers, to see the Middle East not as a problem to solve, but as a civilization finding its own way. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me what I missed. Tell me your story if you live this reality. And if you want more deep dives into the paradoxes that shape our world, subscribe, because the truth is never simple, but it's always worth pursuing.